Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time to an era of fervent faith, shining armor, and truly epic quests, the medieval crusades. But instead of focusing on glorious battles or noble causes, we're going to dive into the surprisingly grim, often horrifying, and intensely uncomfortable reality of being an ordinary crusader. Why your life would be awful as a crusader, boring history for sleep. Forget grand adventures and heroic tales. Imagine trudging thousands of miles, constantly hungry, terrified of disease, and always just one skirmish away from a gruesome end. All for a cause that might feel increasingly distant. Sounds like a tough gig. Right. Being a crusader was indeed a central part of medieval religious fervor. But here's the cheeky reality check if you were one. You probably wouldn't come home a hero, or even come home at all, after years of endless misery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey into the awful reality of being a crusader begins with the most immediate and pervasive torment: grueling march exhaustion, starvation, dehydration. Forget swift travel and comfortable rest stops. Your path to the Holy Land was a slow, agonizing slog across vast distances, making every step a testament to sheer willpower and every day a battle against your body's limits. Imagine the ceaseless pounding of your feet on dusty, rocky paths, the heavy weight of your meager pack digging into your shoulders, and the pervasive ache in every muscle as the sun beat down relentlessly. This was the omnipresent reality of the grueling march. Most crusades, especially the early ones, involved hundreds of thousands of people, not just knights, but foot soldiers, pilgrims, women, and children, moving overland from Western Europe to the Middle East. There were no paved roads, no organized supply lines beyond what could be plundered or bought, often at exorbitant prices, and certainly no medieval tour buses. You were not just a soldier, you were a weary, shuffling automaton, constantly pushing forward into an unknown, unforgiving landscape. It's like being on a modern-day extreme hiking trip, but it lasts for years. You're constantly fighting, and the only energy bar is a questionable piece of dried jerky. The sheer physical toll led to profound exhaustion, day after day, week after week, month after month. You walked often. You marched from dawn until dusk, sometimes even through the night in cooler temperatures. Your sleep was fitful, often on hard ground or in cramped encampments. Imagine the heavy eyelids, the desperate longing for even a few minutes of uninterrupted rest, and the feeling of your body slowly breaking down, your limbs heavy, your mind dull. As fatigue became your constant companion, your armor, if you were lucky enough to have it, felt like a lead weight, and even your simplest movements were an effort. Even more terrifying was the constant threat of starvation. Armies of this size were incredibly difficult to feed. Supplies would quickly run out or spoil, and hostile local populations, more on them later, would often refuse to sell food or demand extortionate prices. You would forage for anything edible, often resorting to eating roots, leaves, or whatever meager game could be caught. Imagine the gnawing emptiness in your stomach that rarely subsided, the lightheadedness that came with prolonged fasting, and the slow wasting away of your body, shedding muscle and fat, as hunger became a pervasive, body-altering reality. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a plump baker, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval MRE delivery service. And worst of all, in those often arid lands, was dehydration. Water sources were often scarce, contaminated, or deliberately poisoned by enemies. Carrying enough water for a large force was impossible, meaning you were constantly thirsty, your body crying out for fluids. Imagine the parched throat, the cracked lips, and the desperate scramble for any muddy puddle or trickling stream, knowing that a few more hours without water could mean collapse, delirium, and eventually, death under the merciless sun. This pervasive, grueling march highlights the sheer physical and logistical nightmare of crusading, demonstrating that merely reaching the Holy Land was an epic feat of endurance that claimed countless lives, making the journey itself an agonizing form of attrition. Even before the battles began, one mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these hardships is the historical accounts from contemporary chroniclers of the First Crusade, such as Raymond of Aguilera and Fulcher of Chartres, who vividly describe the immense suffering of the Crusaders from starvation, thirst, and exhaustion during their overland journey through Anatolia, with thousands dying en route. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, particularly during desperate moments of dehydration, would reportedly resort to drinking the blood of animals they managed to kill, or even attempting to suck dew off leaves in the early morning, believing any moisture was better than none, no matter how unsavory. Imagine trying to quench your thirst by licking a damp leaf. It certainly highlights their dire desperation. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates during the Crusader marches were primarily due to logistical failures and poor planning by the leadership, indicating a fundamental lack of preparedness for such a massive undertaking, or if they were an unavoidable consequence of medieval travel technology and the inherent challenges of moving large armies across vast, hostile territories, regardless of planning. Did it show incompetence? Or just the limits of the age regardless? Your life as a crusader began with a grueling march, leading to profound exhaustion, gnawing starvation, and debilitating dehydration. So, your life as a crusader began with a grueling march, leading to profound exhaustion, gnawing starvation, and debilitating dehydration. But even if you somehow managed to survive the harrowing journey, another, far more insidious, enemy awaited you in the crowded encampments and besieged cities. Horrific sanitation disease, filth, infection. Forget clean water and sterile environments in the medieval Crusader army. Personal hygiene was largely non-existent, making your camp a breeding ground for invisible killers that claimed far more lives than any Saracen blade. Imagine the pervasive stench of human and animal waste, the clouds of flies buzzing around every exposed surface, and the constant fear of the unseen sickness that would sweep through your ranks, taking friend and foe alike. This was the omnipresent reality of horrific sanitation. Medieval armies, by their very nature, were massive congregations of people. Remember those hundreds of thousands from Section 1. Animals, and their accumulated waste, all crammed into temporary, often unsuited, locations. There were no established latrines, no waste disposal systems, and certainly no understanding of germ theory. You were not just a soldier, you were a walking biohazard, constantly breathing, touching, and often consuming the very agents of your demise. It's like being at a modern-day music festival after a week without any waste management. But everyone is also very sick and heavily armed. The inevitable consequence was pervasive filth. Camps would quickly become caked in layers of mud, human excrement, animal dung, and refuse, water sources, whether rivers or wells, would swiftly become contaminated by the sheer volume of people and their waste upstream. Imagine the squelching mud beneath your feet, the constant grime on your skin and clothing, and the desperate attempts to find even a relatively clean spot to sleep, knowing that every surface, every drop of water, was teeming with unseen dangers. The very air you breathed was heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and decaying matter. This rampant uncleanliness created ideal breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was rampant, tearing through armies with devastating speed, leaving soldiers too weak to fight or simply killing them outright. Typhus, smallpox, and various fevers were also common, spreading rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Imagine the sudden onset of debilitating cramps and relentless diarrhea, the burning fever that left you shivering and delirious, or the telltale rash of a deadly contagion appearing on a comrade, knowing that once it took hold, there was little hope of recovery. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a medieval hermit who, admittedly, also had hygiene issues, but at least fewer people, or perhaps just a very effective medieval disinfectant. And then there was the constant threat of infection from even minor wounds. Without sterile instruments or proper wound care, a simple cut from a thorn or a small scrape could quickly turn into a festering, agonizing infection. The dust, dirt, and fecal matter prevalent in the camps would easily enter any break in the skin, leading to gangrene or blood poisoning. Imagine a small scratch on your arm swelling rapidly, turning red and hot, the throbbing pain intensifying day by day. Knowing that without intervention, it could lead to amputation, more on that later, or a slow, agonizing death. This pervasive, horrific sanitation highlights the often underestimated role of disease and poor hygiene in medieval warfare, demonstrating that the Crusaders' most formidable enemy was often not the opposing army, but the invisible killers lurking in their own camps, claiming countless lives and profoundly impacting the success or failure of the campaigns. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the numerous contemporary chronicles of the Crusades that explicitly lament the devastating impact of diseases like dysentery on the Crusader armies, often describing entire camps being incapacitated and vast numbers of soldiers dying from illness rather than combat. Particularly during sieges or prolonged encampments, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Crusaders, in a desperate and often futile attempt to ward off illness, would reportedly carry small pouches filled with aromatic herbs like rue or garlic, holding them to their noses when passing particularly foul-smelling areas, believing the strong scents would protect them from the bad air miasma thought to cause disease. Imagine trying to fight off dysentery with a pocket full of garlic. It certainly highlights their rudimentary understanding of health. Historians still argue whether the devastating impact of disease on Crusader armies was primarily due to their intrinsic lack of hygiene and medical knowledge, making them uniquely vulnerable to pathogens, or if it was also exacerbated by the novelty of unfamiliar diseases encountered in foreign lands, to which their immune systems had no prior exposure. Did it show their ignorance, or just bad luck regardless? Your life as a Crusader was plagued by horrific sanitation, leading to rampant disease, pervasive filth, and debilitating infection. So, your life as a Crusader was plagued by horrific sanitation, leading to rampant disease, pervasive filth, and debilitating infection. But even if you managed to evade the invisible enemy of sickness, the visible one was ever present, making every moment outside the relative safety of your camp a terrifying gamble. Constant danger, skirmishes, ambushes, brutality. Forget clear battlefields and organized warfare. In the unpredictable landscape of the Holy Land, death lurked around every bend, making your journey a continuous, nerve-wracking dance with violent, sudden encounters. Imagine the sudden, piercing shriek of an alarm, the chaotic clash of steel on steel, and the chilling sight of comrades falling around you, struck down by an unseen enemy. This was the omnipresent reality of constant danger. Unlike the grand, set-piece battles often depicted in legends, much of Crusader warfare consisted of endless small-scale engagements. As you marched, remember that grueling march from Section 1, foraged or scouted. You were perpetually vulnerable to hostile forces who knew the terrain far better than you. You were not just a soldier, you were a walking target, constantly on edge. Your senses heightened to detect any sign of impending attack. It's like being a modern-day special forces operative on continuous patrol. But you have medieval armor, no night vision, and the enemy could be literally anyone. The most frequent threat came from skirmishes. These were often brief, chaotic engagements with small groups of opposing forces, local garrisons, Bedouin raiders, or scouting parties. They could occur at any time, in any place while fetching water, gathering firewood, or simply marching through a narrow pass. Imagine the sudden shower of arrows from a hidden vantage point, the desperate scramble to draw your sword as horsemen suddenly appeared from a gully, and the brutal, close quarters fighting that erupted, often ending as quickly as it began, leaving casualties on both sides and an adrenaline-fueled terror in its wake. Even more terrifying were expertly planned ambushes. Local forces, intimately familiar with the terrain, would lie in wait at choke points, river crossings, or forested areas, springing upon unsuspecting Crusader detachments. The element of surprise amplified the lethality, turning a routine march into a desperate fight for survival. Imagine the sudden silence of the birds, the unnatural stillness of the air, and then the terrifying eruption of shouts and steel as you were caught completely unawares. Surrounded and outnumbered, with no clear path to escape. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a cloistered monk, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval drone for reconnaissance. The brutality of these encounters was absolute. There was little quarter given or expected. Captured enemies might face torture, mutilation, or summary execution, even if you survived a skirmish. You might witness unspeakable acts, or be forced to commit them yourself in the heat of battle. Imagine the desperate screams of the wounded, the merciless swing of a battle axe, and the chilling realization that your life could be extinguished in an instant, or worse, that you could fall into enemy hands. This casual, pervasive violence was a constant psychological battering. This relentless, constant danger highlights the grim reality of daily life for a crusader, demonstrating that the pursuit of the Holy Land was not just about grand battles, but a relentless, nerve-wracking war of attrition fought in countless small, brutal encounters, making every day a question of survival. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this constant threat is the frequent mention in Crusader chronicles of daily harassment, raids, and ambushes carried out by local Muslim forces, such as the Turkopoles, against Crusader foraging parties, supply convoys, and marching columns, often leading to significant casualties and logistical disruption. Confirming that these were not isolated incidents, but a systemic form of warfare. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, particularly those who became highly superstitious due to the constant danger, would reportedly carry small pouches filled with holy earth from famous battlefields or saints' graves back in Europe, believing these small talismans would offer them supernatural protection against ambushes and enemy blades. A sort of desperate magical insurance policy. Imagine trusting your life to a handful of dirt. It certainly highlights their desperate search for comfort amidst relentless peril. Historians still argue whether the constant danger faced by crusaders from skirmishes and ambushes primarily contributed to a hardened, more effective fighting force, forcing them to remain vigilant and adaptable, or if it instead led to pervasive exhaustion, demoralization, and high rates of desertion, ultimately undermining the long-term effectiveness of their armies. Did it make them tougher, or just break them regardless? Your life as a crusader was defined by constant danger, facing relentless skirmishes, terrifying ambushes, and pervasive brutality. So, your life as a crusader was defined by constant danger, facing relentless skirmishes, terrifying ambushes, and pervasive brutality. But even if you survived the blade, the arrow, or the mace, another horrifying reality awaited you if you fell ill or suffered a wound. Primitive medicine amputation. Pain. No cures. Forget sterile operating rooms and effective pain relief in the medieval Crusader army. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often leading to more suffering than healing, making every injury a terrifying lottery for your life and limbs. Imagine the crude instruments, the agonizing screams of a comrade undergoing surgery without anesthesia, and the chilling certainty that even a minor ailment could escalate into a slow, agonizing death. This was the omnipresent reality of primitive medicine, medieval understanding of anatomy, germ theory, and effective treatments was incredibly limited. Physicians, when available, often relied on ancient texts, superstition, and invasive, painful procedures that frequently did more harm than good. You were not just a soldier, you were a guinea pig in a medical dark age, where healing often involved further torment. It's like being at a modern-day emergency room, but the doctors are using rusty gardening tools, and their preferred anesthetic is a strong piece of wood to bite on. One of the most common and terrifying procedures was amputation. Faced with severe infections, remember those from horrific sanitation in Section 2 or crushed limbs from battle. The only perceived solution was often to cut off the affected part. This was done without proper anesthesia, perhaps a strong drink, or a blow to the head, and with unsterilized saws and knives. Imagine the agonizing shrieks of a man as a limb was crudely sawn away, the spurting blood, and the subsequent days of fever and delirium as infection almost certainly set in, even if you survived the initial procedure. The chances of dying from post-operative infection were astronomically high. This meant pain was a constant, unavoidable companion, whether from a fresh wound, a poorly set bone, or the aftermath of a crude surgical procedure. Relief was rarely an option. Opium and other pain-relieving substances were either unknown, scarce, or used incorrectly. You simply endured, gritting your teeth, or succumbing to a merciful unconsciousness brought on by shock or fever. Imagine the throbbing agony of a deep sword cut, the searing pain of a burn, or the relentless ache of a compound fracture. With no escape from the torment beyond the eventual loss of consciousness or death, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life where you never left your bed. Or perhaps just a very effective medieval supply of modern painkillers. And most critically, there were often effectively no cures for the widespread diseases and severe injuries. For common ailments like dysentery, remember that from Section 2, or for a serious battle wound, the outcome was often left to fate or divine intervention. Herbal remedies were sometimes used, but their efficacy was limited, and proper diagnosis was rare. If your body couldn't fight off the illness or heal the wound itself, you were almost certainly doomed. Imagine watching a comrade waste away from a simple fever, or seeing a gaping wound fester and turn black, knowing that despite all the prayers and basic poultices, there was nothing that could truly save them. This pervasive primitive medicine highlights the brutal reality of physical suffering in the medieval Crusades, demonstrating that injury and illness were not just minor setbacks, but often agonizing death sentences, and that the care available was often as terrifying as the initial affliction, making every soldier a vulnerable target for ailments unseen and wounds untreatable. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this brutal reality is the discovery of skeletal remains from Crusader-era cemeteries in the Levant, displaying clear evidence of severe battle trauma, poorly healed fractures, and evidence of amputations, often with signs of subsequent infection. Corroborating the grim descriptions of medieval medical practices from contemporary chronicles, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Crusader surgeons, often barbers or priests with rudimentary medical knowledge, would reportedly attempt to stop severe bleeding from large wounds by cauterizing them with red-hot irons, a method that caused immense pain and often led to widespread tissue damage, but was seen as a desperate measure to prevent immediate blood loss. Imagine having a glowing hot piece of metal pressed against your flesh to stop a wound. It certainly highlights the horrifying choices made in the absence of real medical knowledge. Historians still argue whether the rudimentary medical practices of the Crusaders primarily contributed to higher mortality rates and prolonged suffering, directly diminishing their fighting strength, or if the sheer faith and resilience of some individuals, alongside basic wound care, occasionally led to miraculous recoveries that defied the limitations of medieval medicine. Did it kill more than save? Or did faith play a part in survival regardless? Your life as a Crusader meant facing primitive medicine, involving terrifying amputation, constant pain, and effectively no cures. Word count 1060. So, your life as a crusader meant facing primitive medicine, involving terrifying amputation, constant pain, and effectively no cures. But even if you somehow avoided a crippling injury or a fatal disease, the natural world itself often became your tormentor: extreme weather heat stroke, frostbite, exposure. Forget temperate climates and predictable seasons. Your journey and campaigns would drag you through brutal environmental extremes, making the very air around you a weapon that claimed countless lives. Imagine the blistering sun beating down on your helmet, feeling your brain bake inside your skull, or the icy wind cutting through your thin tunic, turning your fingers numb with cold. This was the omnipresent reality of extreme weather. The Crusader routes traversed vastly different climates, from the temperate zones of Europe to the scorching deserts of the Middle East, and sometimes the surprisingly cold mountains and plateaus. You were often ill-equipped for these rapid changes, and shelter was a luxury rarely afforded. You were not just a soldier, you were a fragile human battling the raw, indifferent forces of nature, often losing. It's like being a modern-day meteorologist, but your forecast is always terrible, and your equipment is just your own suffering body. The most notorious killer in the Middle East was heat stroke, dressed in heavy wool or linen, carrying cumbersome armor and weapons, and marching for hours under the relentless desert sun. Remember that grueling march from Section 1? Your body would quickly overheat. Dehydration also from Section 1 exacerbated the problem, leading to rapid exhaustion, confusion, and eventually, collapse and death. Imagine the desperate thirst that no amount of water could quench, the dizzying sensation as your core temperature rose, and the terrifying knowledge that simply existing in that environment was pushing your body to its absolute limit. Even without a battle, your armor, designed for protection, would become a literal oven. Conversely, especially during winter marches through Anatolia or in the mountainous regions, frostbite and exposure to biting cold were equally deadly. Medieval clothing, while perhaps worn by European standards, was rarely sufficient for open bivouacs and freezing temperatures, particularly when wet. Soldiers would sleep on the ground, without proper tents for many, and succumb to hypothermia. Imagine waking up to numb, stiff fingers and toes, the searing pain as blood returned to frozen tissue, or the desperate shivering that wouldn't stop, knowing that the cold was slowly stealing your ability to move, to fight, and ultimately, to live. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life in a Mediterranean villa, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval heated blanket. Beyond direct heat stroke or frostbite, prolonged exposure to the elements simply wore you down. Constant rain could lead to hypothermia and trench foot. Strong winds could scatter camps and make marching miserable. Sandstorms in the desert could blind you, clog your lungs, and disorient your entire force. Imagine the gritty sensation of sand in your mouth and eyes, the feeling of your clothes perpetually damp and cold, and the relentless, spirit-sapping struggle against the wind and rain. Day after day, turning comfort into a distant memory, this pervasive extreme weather highlights the profound environmental challenges faced by Crusaders, demonstrating that the very landscape itself was a formidable, indiscriminate enemy, claiming countless lives and profoundly impacting the morale and effectiveness of armies, proving that nature could be as brutal as any opposing force. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these environmental challenges is the well-documented suffering of Crusaders during their overland journeys through Anatolia, where they faced scorching summer heats and bitter winter colds, leading to significant casualties from environmental exposure, particularly highlighted in accounts of the First Crusade's passage through regions like the Anatolian Plateau. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Crusaders, in a desperate attempt to ward off both sunstroke and frostbite, would reportedly smear animal fat or a mixture of mud and urine on their exposed skin, believing it offered a protective layer against the elements. often with little actual benefit and probably making them smell quite delightful. Imagine trying to protect yourself from the elements with a coating of animal grease and other things. It certainly highlights their rudimentary knowledge of survival. Historians still argue whether the devastating impact of extreme weather on Crusader armies was primarily due to their commanders' lack of foresight and planning for diverse climates, indicating a failure of strategic intelligence, or if it was an unavoidable consequence of medieval logistical limitations and the sheer unpredictability of campaigning across such vast and varied geographical regions. Regardless of how well commanders planned, did it show poor leadership or just the limits of the era regardless? Your life as a crusader was a constant battle against extreme weather, facing lethal heat stroke, debilitating frostbite, and relentless exposure. So, your life as a crusader was a constant battle against extreme weather, facing lethal heat stroke, debilitating frostbite, and relentless exposure. But even if the elements somehow spared you, a more fundamental and pervasive misery haunted your every waking moment. Scarcity of food hunger, malnutrition, foraging. Forget regular meals and a balanced diet. On crusade, you were in a perpetual state of hunger, constantly struggling to find enough to eat, making your body a slow-motion battlefield of nutrient deprivation. Imagine the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the persistent dull ache that rarely subsided, and the insidious weakness that crept into your limbs, making even simple tasks feel monumental. This was the omnipresent reality of scarcity of food. Feeding an army of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, was a monumental logistical challenge for medieval commanders. Supply lines were unreliable at best, non-existent at worst, especially as you moved through hostile or sparsely populated territories. What little food was available was often of poor quality, spoiled, or exorbitantly priced. You were not just a soldier, you were a perpetual forager, always on the lookout for anything edible. Your survival a daily scramble against the forces of starvation. It's like being on a modern-day extreme survival show, but there are no cameras, no prize money, and you're doing it for years on end while also fighting a war. The most immediate and persistent symptom was sheer hunger. This wasn't just missing a meal, this was the deep, agonizing hunger that affects your mood, your judgment, and your very will to continue. Your body would begin to consume itself, breaking down muscle for energy. Imagine the pangs that intensified with every passing hour, the constant daydreaming of sumptuous feast back home, and the desperate yearning for even a crust of stale bread, a desire so strong it could overwhelm all other thoughts. Prolonged hunger inevitably led to malnutrition. Your diet, even when you found food, was often unbalanced and insufficient. You'd lack essential vitamins and minerals, leading to a host of debilitating conditions. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C would cause bleeding gums, weakness, and eventually death. Rickets, anemia, and other deficiency diseases would further weaken your body, making you more susceptible to illness. Remember those from horrific sanitation in Section 2 and less effective in combat. Imagine your teeth loosening, your muscles wasting away, and your skin becoming sallow, as your body slowly deteriorated from the inside out, turning you into a gaunt shadow of your former self. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a medieval peasant with a steady, if meager, diet, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval vitamin supplement. To combat this, foraging became unnecessary and often dangerous. Daily activity. Soldiers would fan out from the main column, risking ambushes. Remember constant danger from Section 3 from local populations or rival forces. Just to find food. This often meant plundering fields, stealing livestock, or desperately searching for wild roots and berries, some of which might be poisonous. Imagine the desperate search through barren fields, the tense moments spent sneaking into a village in search of chickens, and the moral compromises you might make, resorting to theft or violence, simply to put something, anything, in your empty stomach. This pervasive scarcity of food highlights the fundamental logistical nightmare of medieval long-distance warfare, demonstrating that hunger and malnutrition were chronic, debilitating problems for crusaders, profoundly weakening their armies and leading to widespread suffering that often overshadowed even the horrors of direct combat. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the frequent and vivid descriptions in Crusader chronicles of widespread famine within the Crusader armies, particularly during sieges or prolonged marches through barren lands, leading to acts of desperation such as eating their horses or even in extreme cases, cannibalism as recorded during the siege of Ma'arat al-Nu'man in 1098. Underscoring the severe and sustained nature of their hunger, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, in an attempt to make their meager rations last longer or seem more substantial, would reportedly mix their small portions of grain or flour with sawdust, dirt, or even ground-up bones, creating a horrifying, indigestible filler that often led to severe stomach ailments but helped to fill the void of hunger. Imagine trying to make a meal out of dirt and bone fragments. It certainly highlights the depths of their desperation for sustenance. Historians still argue whether the chronic scarcity of food during the Crusades was primarily a consequence of the vast distances and underdeveloped supply chains inherent in medieval warfare, making it an unavoidable challenge, or if it also reflected a deliberate strategy by some commanders who prioritized speed and movement over the sustained well-being of their troops. Viewing some attrition as acceptable, did it show logistical limits or strategic ruthlessness? Regardless, your life as a crusader was defined by the relentless scarcity of food, enduring constant hunger, debilitating malnutrition, and dangerous foraging. So, your life as a crusader was defined by the relentless scarcity of food, enduring constant hunger, debilitating malnutrition, and dangerous foraging. But even if you miraculously found enough to eat, another pervasive and insidious threat loomed large: the profound friction and misunderstanding that arose from your encounters with the local populations and cultures. Cultural clashes, mistrust, hostility, misunderstanding. Forget friendly greetings and easy integration in the unfamiliar lands of the East. Every interaction was fraught with suspicion, differing customs, and often outright animosity, making your presence as much a source of conflict as any pitched battle. Imagine the wary glances from villagers as you passed through their lands, the sudden eruption of anger over a misinterpreted gesture, or the chilling realization that the people around you viewed you not as a liberator, but as an invading barbarian. This was the omnipresent reality of cultural clashes. You, a Western European, were thrust into societies with vastly different languages, religions, customs, and social norms. The crusading ideology often painted the local populations, both Muslim and Eastern Christian, as infidels or schismatics, fostering an inherent distrust from the outset. You were not just a warrior, you were an alien, navigating a complex social landscape where every smile could hide a sneer, and every offer of hospitality could be a trap. It's like being a modern-day tourist trying to navigate a country without a guide, a phrase book, or any concept of local etiquette. But with a sword and a holy mission, the most immediate problem was pervasive mistrust. Locals, often suffering from the plundering of passing Crusader armies, remember that foraging from Section 6 viewed you with deep suspicion. They feared your intentions, your numbers, and your perceived barbarity. You, in turn, often viewed them with a mixture of disdain and paranoia. Fearing ambushes, remember constant danger from Section 3 or poisoning. Imagine trying to buy supplies from a local market. The seller's eyes filled with suspicion, haggling becoming a tense standoff, and the constant feeling that you were being watched, judged, and perhaps hated. Simply for existing in their land, this mistrust frequently escalated into outright hostility. What might seem like a minor offense to you, taking water from a well, trampling crops, or entering a mosque out of curiosity, could be perceived as a grave insult or an act of aggression, leading to violent confrontations, raids by local militias, retaliatory attacks, and open acts of sabotage against Crusader foraging parties were common. Imagine a shouted exchange escalating into a drawn sword, the sudden eruption of violence over a misunderstanding about property, and the grim reality that peaceful coexistence was a fragile, often impossible, dream in a land simmering with resentment. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life back in your familiar village, or perhaps just a very effective medieval Rosetta Stone. And underpinning it all was profound misunderstanding. You and the locals operated under completely different social codes and religious interpretations. Your concept of a holy war was alien to many, and their nuanced theological differences within Islam were utterly lost on most crusaders. Even communication was a massive barrier. Very few crusaders spoke Arabic, and even fewer locals spoke any Western European language. Imagine trying to negotiate a ceasefire or explain your intentions, only to be met with blank stares or angry shouts, knowing that your words, even if understood, might be twisted by layers of cultural prejudice. This constant cultural clashes highlights the deep-seated friction inherent in the Crusader enterprise, demonstrating how the journey to the Holy Land was not just a military campaign, but a continuous collision of vastly different worlds, leading to pervasive mistrust, open hostility, and profound misunderstanding that ultimately undermined the Crusaders' ability to secure lasting peace or effective governance. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these clashes is the documented instances of conflicts between Crusaders and Eastern Christian communities, like the Armenians or Orthodox Byzantines, despite theoretically sharing a faith. Due to theological differences, cultural misunderstandings, and Crusader plundering, demonstrating that hostility wasn't solely directed at Muslims. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Crusaders, in a misguided attempt at cultural integration, or perhaps just out of sheer curiosity, would reportedly try to participate in local customs or ceremonies that they completely misunderstood, sometimes leading to humorous for an outsider but often deeply offensive or dangerous situations for both sides. Imagine trying to join a local Muslim prayer ceremony and accidentally doing something wildly inappropriate. It certainly highlights the depths of their cross-cultural ignorance. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of cultural clashes during the Crusades was primarily an inevitable outcome of religious fanaticism and the inherent xenophobia of medieval societies, making widespread conflict unavoidable, or if it was exacerbated by specific acts of Crusader brutality and arrogance, which provoked unnecessary hostility and undermined any potential for peaceful relations. Did it show inherent intolerance? Or just bad behavior regardless? Your life as a Crusader was perpetually complicated by cultural clashes, leading to pervasive mistrust, open hostility, and constant misunderstanding. So, your life as a Crusader was perpetually complicated by cultural clashes, leading to pervasive mistrust, open hostility, and constant misunderstanding. But beyond the external dangers and the physical deprivations, the very act of embarking on a crusade, especially for the common soldier, often meant sacrificing everything you owned and facing a chilling prospect financial ruin debt. Loss, impoverishment, forget riches and glorious rewards, for many. The holy quest was a fast track to destitution, leaving your family destitute and your future bleak. Imagine selling off your family's meager possessions, incurring crippling debts just to equip yourself, and the dawning realization that your entire worldly estate was vanishing, piece by painful piece. This was the omnipresent reality of financial ruin. Crusades were incredibly expensive undertakings, both for the individual and for society. While some wealthy nobles could afford to finance their expeditions, the vast majority of ordinary crusaders, whether knights or foot soldiers, had to fund their participation through desperate means. You were not just a warrior, you were an economic gamble, betting your entire future and that of your family on a perilous journey with highly uncertain returns. It's like being a modern-day startup founder, but your investment is your entire life savings. Your product is a holy war, and your ROI is a one-way ticket to poverty. The immediate problem was debt. To buy armor, weapons, a horse if you were a knight, provisions, and pay for passage. Many crusaders had to borrow heavily. They would mortgage their lands, sell off future harvests, or take loans from moneylenders at exorbitant interest rates. Imagine the parchment contracts, the solemn vows to repay, and the terrifying knowledge that if you failed to return, or returned empty-handed, your family would be left with an insurmountable burden, possibly losing their ancestral lands or being forced into servitude. This economic pressure was a constant, gnawing anxiety. This often led to immense loss of property and status. Land, the primary source of wealth and power in the medieval world, was frequently sold or leased for ridiculously low sums to raise funds. Tools, livestock, and even personal heirlooms might be pawned or sold off when a crusader died en route or in battle, which was very common. Remember all those sections on danger. Their family often had no means to reclaim what was lost, or to repay the debts. Imagine the heartbreak of parting with a family heirloom, the desperate sight of your fields being sold, and the chilling thought that you were willingly dismantling your family's future for a distant dream. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life staying home and farming, or perhaps just a very effective medieval microfinance system. The ultimate consequence was utter impoverishment, even if you survived and returned. You might find yourself with nothing. Your lands might be gone, your family scattered, and your former position in society lost. The romantic ideal of returning a wealthy hero, laden with spoils from the East, was a rarity for the common crusader. More often, you returned a broken man, physically and financially, facing a bleak and uncertain future. Imagine trudging back to your village, scarred and weary, only to find your home occupied by others, your family dispersed, and your life's work undone, all for a cause that now felt hollow. This pervasive financial ruin highlights the immense personal sacrifice demanded of ordinary crusaders, demonstrating that the taking of the cross was often an act of desperate economic gamble, profoundly impacting their families and their future, often leading to destitution and a life far worse than the one they left behind, even if they survived. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this economic burden is the papal decrees issued during the Crusades that offered various financial incentives, such as indulgences for crusader debts and permission to mortgage property, explicitly acknowledging the immense economic strain placed on individuals who took the cross and attempting to mitigate the financial disincentives. Though often with limited real-world effect for the poor, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some extremely desperate crusaders, particularly those from the peasant class with almost nothing to sell, would reportedly commit themselves or even their children into temporary servitude to wealthy merchants or knights in exchange for the funds needed to reach the Holy Land, essentially selling their freedom for a chance at salvation. Imagine selling yourself into temporary slavery just to go on a holy war. It certainly highlights the dire straits many found themselves in. Historians still argue whether the widespread financial ruin experienced by many crusaders primarily served as a testament to their profound religious devotion, as they sacrificed all earthly possessions for a spiritual cause, or if it was more a reflection of the cynical exploitation of religious fervor by wealthy elites in the church. Who benefited from the sale of property and the flow of desperate recruits? Did it show great faith or great exploitation? Regardless, your life as a crusader was haunted by the specter of financial ruin, leading to crippling debt, irreversible loss, and profound impoverishment. So, your life as a crusader was haunted by the specter of financial ruin, leading to crippling debt, irreversible loss, and profound impoverishment. But even if you somehow weathered the economic storm, the human mind was perhaps the most vulnerable casualty of the relentless warfare psychological trauma violence. Despair. PTSD. Forget heroic glory and spiritual uplift. The daily reality of the Crusades was a brutal assault on your psyche, leaving indelible scars that festered long after the battles ended. Imagine the persistent nightmares of the horrors you witnessed, the sudden, inexplicable fits of rage or weeping, and the chilling sensation of feeling utterly disconnected from the world around you, even your loved ones. This was the omnipresent reality of psychological trauma. You were not just a soldier, you were a human being exposed to unimaginable levels of stress, fear, and brutality, day after day, for months or even years. Modern understanding calls it PTSD. But in the medieval world, it was simply the unspoken burden of a crusader, often misinterpreted as a spiritual failing or divine punishment. It's like being a modern-day war correspondent, but you're also fighting in the war, and there's no therapy available. The most obvious source was constant exposure to extreme violence. You not only inflicted it, remember that constant danger from Section 3, but you witnessed it daily. In its most gruesome forms, dismemberment, torture, massacres, and the agonizing deaths of comrades. Your brain, overwhelmed, struggled to process such horror, leading to intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and a general hypervigilance that never truly subsided. Imagine the vivid, unwanted replays of a comrade being disemboweled, the smell of burning flesh perhaps from public executions in another era, but definitely from besieged towns here haunting your nose even when absent, and the inability to shake off the pervasive sense of dread. Even during moments of relative calm, this constant exposure, combined with the extreme hardships, remember hunger, disease, and weather, inevitably led to profound despair. The sheer scale of suffering, the futility of many efforts, and the agonizing loss of friends could crush your spirit. The initial religious fervor, more on that later, that propelled you, might wither under the relentless brutality, leaving only an aching emptiness and a sense of hopelessness. Imagine staring blankly into the distance, feeling an overwhelming sadness that no victory could alleviate, and the chilling thought that all your suffering, all your sacrifice, was ultimately meaningless, leading to a deep, pervasive melancholia. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a complete amnesiac, or perhaps just a very effective medieval trauma counselor, while not understood in modern terms. The symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, would have been rampant. Insomnia, night terrors, extreme irritability, emotional numbness, social withdrawal compounded by cultural clashes from Section 7, and heightened startle responses would have been common. Returning crusaders, often unable to articulate their experiences, would have struggled to reintegrate into their former lives, becoming alienated from their families and communities. Imagine flinching at every sudden noise, finding solace only in the company of other scarred veterans, and the profound isolation of being unable to explain the horrors that haunted your waking hours, leaving you a stranger in your own home. This pervasive psychological trauma highlights the profound, often invisible, cost of crusading, demonstrating that the medieval warrior's greatest battle was often within themselves, against the enduring mental scars of a brutal war, leaving them deeply altered and struggling to find peace long after the fighting had ended. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these psychological impacts is the accounts of some crusaders experiencing profound melancholia or madness upon their return, or even during campaigns, attributed by contemporaries to demonic influence or spiritual weakness, but now understood by historians as likely manifestations of severe psychological distress and trauma. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, particularly those haunted by the violence, would reportedly develop obsessive rituals or superstitions, such as meticulously cleaning their weapons after every encounter, or repeating specific prayers a precise number of times, believing these actions could cleanse them of the horrors or ward off evil spirits. A primitive form of coping mechanism. Imagine compulsively scrubbing blood from your sword every night, even if it wasn't there. It certainly highlights their desperate attempts to regain control in a chaotic world. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma experienced by Crusaders primarily served to strengthen their religious conviction, leading them to deeper spiritual reliance in the face of suffering, or if it more often led to a profound spiritual crisis, disillusionment, and a questioning of their faith in the face of such overwhelming brutality. Did it make them holier, or just more broken regardless? Your life as a crusader exposed you to profound psychological trauma, leaving you scarred by violence, consumed by despair, and haunted by the symptoms of PTSD. So, your life as a crusader exposed you to profound psychological trauma, leaving you scarred by violence, consumed by despair, and haunted by the symptoms of PTSD. But even if your mind held a fragile grip on reality, the very tools of your trade were constantly conspiring against you: equipment breakdown wear, damage, no replacements. Forget perfectly maintained gear and reliable supply chains. Your armor rusted, your sword dulled, and your shield splintered, making every piece of your kit a potential point of failure in the brutal environment of medieval warfare. Imagine the agonizing squeak of rusty chainmail, the sudden snap of a bowstring at a crucial moment, or the terrifying sight of a dented helmet offering scant protection against a crushing blow. This was the omnipresent reality of equipment breakdown. Medieval armor, weapons, and tools were robust for their time, but they were still subject to the relentless wear and tear of continuous campaigning. Brutal combat and harsh environments. Remember extreme weather from Section 5. There were no standardized parts, no vast armories of spares, and skilled smiths were a rare luxury on the march. You were not just a soldier, you were a walking collection of failing gear, constantly improvising repairs and praying your equipment wouldn't betray you at the worst possible moment. It's like being a modern-day soldier, but your uniform is made of cardboard, your rifle keeps jamming, and the only replacement parts are scavenged from fallen enemies. The constant wear on your gear was relentless. Armor, especially mail, would rust in damp conditions and chafe in the heat. Leather straps would rot, stitching would fray, and wooden shafts would splinter. Imagine the dull sheen of corrosion on your breastplate, the irritating rub of worn straps on your skin, and the knowledge that every day of marching and fighting was slowly degrading the very protection you relied upon. Even your boots, if you were lucky enough to have sturdy ones, would wear thin, leaving your feet raw and exposed, beyond general wear. Direct damage from combat was inevitable. A sword blow could dent your helmet or armor, weakening it for future impacts. A shield could be split by an axe, leaving you exposed. A spear shaft might snap, or an arrowhead shatter. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were potentially fatal flaws. Imagine the sickening clang as a mace smashed into your shoulder plate, leaving a deep gouge, and the chilling realization that your life might depend on that already weakened spot holding up against the next strike, or the frustration of a dull sword that simply wouldn't cut. Leaving you struggling in a desperate melee, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a tailor, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval mobile repair unit. And most critically, there were effectively no replacements. If a vital piece of your equipment broke, you were often out of luck. You couldn't just order new parts or pick up a fresh sword from a supply depot. You either had to make do with what you had, scavenge from the dead, or attempt crude, often ineffective, field repairs. A broken sword might be shortened into a dagger, a splintered shield might be patched with leather, but these were always compromises. Imagine fighting with a bent helmet that obscured your vision, or a cracked shield that offered only partial protection. Knowing that your chances of survival were diminishing with every compromised piece of gear, this pervasive equipment breakdown highlights the immense practical challenges faced by Crusaders in maintaining their fighting effectiveness over long campaigns, demonstrating that their personal gear was often a critical vulnerability, constantly on the verge of failure, and that improvising survival with failing equipment was a daily and dangerous necessity. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these challenges is the archaeological findings from Crusader castles and battle sites, which often include numerous broken weapon fragments, damaged armor pieces, and discarded tools, providing tangible evidence of the wear and tear and the lack of comprehensive repair or resupply capabilities for common soldiers. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, particularly those with a knack for improvisation, would reportedly use boiled leather, animal bones, or even tightly woven layers of discarded cloth, attempting to craft makeshift repairs or even entirely new, though inferior pieces of armor or protective gear for themselves, creating a bizarre patchwork of desperate battlefield solutions. Imagine fighting a holy war with a helmet made partially of boiled cowhide. It certainly highlights their ingenuity born of desperation. Historians still argue whether the widespread problem of equipment breakdown among Crusader armies primarily contributed to a significant decline in their overall military effectiveness over long campaigns, making them less capable against well-supplied local forces, or if it instead fostered greater resourcefulness and adaptability among individual soldiers, forcing them to become more skilled at improvisation and survival in adverse conditions. Did it weaken them? Or make them more adaptable? Regardless, your life as a crusader was a constant struggle against equipment breakdown, enduring relentless wear, pervasive damage, and the disheartening reality of no replacements. So, your life as a crusader was a constant struggle against equipment breakdown, enduring relentless wear, pervasive damage, and the disheartening reality of no replacements. But even if your gear miraculously held together, a more insidious enemy often came from within the Crusader ranks themselves. Leadership disputes, infighting, betrayal, chaos. Forget unified command and common purpose. The Crusader leadership was a cauldron of ambitious, often petty, feudal lords, making every strategic decision a battle of egos and every campaign vulnerable to internal sabotage. Imagine the bitter arguments echoing through the war council tents, the sudden withdrawal of a powerful contingent due to a personal slight, and the chilling realization that your army's greatest threat might be its own leaders, pulling in different directions. This was the omnipresent reality of leadership disputes. The Crusades were not led by a single, undisputed commander, but by a collection of independent feudal lords, each with their own retinues, their own agendas, and their own claims to status and glory. This decentralized structure was inherently prone to conflict, undermining cohesion and effectiveness. You were not just a loyal soldier, you were a pawn in a deadly game of medieval politics, where your life could be sacrificed for a personal grudge or a lord's ambition. It's like being part of a modern-day corporate merger. But instead of PowerPoint presentations, disagreements are settled with swords, and your pension plan depends on who stabs whom. The most common manifestation was blatant infighting. Lords would argue over precedence, plunder, strategic decisions, or even perceived insults. These disputes could escalate from heated words to outright armed clashes between different Crusader contingents. Diverting vital resources and attention from the common enemy, imagine a rival lord refusing to commit his troops to a crucial battle simply because he felt another commander had been given more honor, leaving your flank exposed, and the simmering resentment among the rank and file as they watched their leaders bicker while the true enemy approached. Even more destructive was outright betrayal, driven by personal gain, rivalry, or a desperate desire to protect their own interests. Some leaders might withhold support, abandon allies in battle, or even make secret deals with the enemy. This could lead to catastrophic defeats and a profound erosion of trust throughout the army. Imagine hearing whispers that a powerful count had deliberately delayed his advance, leaving your comrades to be overwhelmed, and the chilling realization that the person you were fighting alongside might be your undoing. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life under a benevolent king, or perhaps just a very effective medieval conflict resolution mediator. The ultimate consequence of these disputes was widespread chaos. Orders would be contradictory, plans would unravel, and opportunities would be squandered. Marches would be delayed, sieges prolonged, and battles lost. Not due to enemy strength, but due to the internal disunity of the Crusader command, this lack of clear, unified leadership permeated down to your level, leaving you confused, demoralized, and vulnerable. Imagine receiving conflicting orders from different knights. Standing idly by as a critical moment was missed because two commanders couldn't agree on a strategy, and the profound frustration of seeing your valiant efforts undone by the petty squabbles of your superiors. This pervasive leadership disputes highlights a fundamental weakness of the Crusader enterprise, demonstrating how the personal ambitions and rivalries of feudal lords often sabotage the very goals they ostensibly shared, leading to widespread infighting, devastating betrayals, and ultimately, chaotic campaigns that needlessly cost countless lives and undermined the crusading cause. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this problem is the numerous documented instances of Crusader leaders refusing to cooperate, such as Raymond IV of Toulouse's repeated clashes with Bohemond of Taranto during the First Crusade, or the crippling internal divisions among the leaders of the Second Crusade that contributed directly to its disastrous failure. Underscoring the chronic nature of these rivalries, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Crusader leaders, particularly those with inflated egos, would reportedly hire scribes to meticulously record every perceived slight or disrespectful action by their fellow commanders, creating detailed grudge lists that they would consult before making tactical decisions. Prioritizing personal vendettas over military objectives. Imagine a general consulting his enemy list before deciding whether to send reinforcements. It certainly highlights the petty and dangerous nature of their internal politics. Historians still argue whether the consistent leadership disputes during the Crusades were primarily an inevitable byproduct of the feudal system, where independent lords were not accustomed to unified command, or if they were also exacerbated by the immense personal stakes and religious fervor of the Crusades, which amplified individual ambitions and made compromise more difficult. Did it show inherent feudal flaws, or just human nature amplified by faith regardless? Your life as a Crusader was constantly threatened by leadership disputes, plagued by relentless infighting, chilling betrayal, and pervasive chaos. So, your life as a Crusader was constantly threatened by leadership disputes, plagued by relentless infighting, chilling betrayal, and pervasive chaos. But even amidst the physical dangers and the political machinations, an equally debilitating misery, often unspoken, gnawed at your soul: homesickness, isolation, loneliness, separation. Forget letters from loved ones and regular communication. Your crusade was a journey into profound emotional distance, severing you from everything familiar and leaving you adrift in a world light years away from home. Imagine the aching longing for the sight of your village, the sound of your family's voices, or the simple comfort of familiar surroundings, all overshadowed by the vast, insurmountable distance between you and everything you held dear. This was the omnipresent reality of homesickness. You had left your entire life behind: family, friends, land, culture, and language, for a journey that could last years, even a lifetime. Communication was almost non-existent. Letters were rare and took months, if they arrived at all. You were not just a soldier, you were an emotional exile, constantly carrying the burden of absence, your heart yearning for a connection that might never be reestablished. It's like being a modern-day astronaut on a long-duration mission. But there's no video call, no internet, and you have no idea if Earth is even still there. The most profound impact was crushing isolation. You were surrounded by thousands of people, yet utterly alone in your longing. The common soldier often had no close companions from their home village, thrown together with strangers from different regions speaking different dialects. The shared hardship provided some camaraderie, but it couldn't fill the void of deep personal connection. Imagine the quiet moments in the camp, surrounded by the murmur of unfamiliar tongues, feeling a profound sense of detachment, even from your fellow crusaders, realizing that no one truly understood the life you had left behind. This isolation inevitably led to crippling loneliness. The emotional distance from your loved ones was a constant ache. You worried about your wife, your children, your aging parents, with no way of knowing if they were well or even alive. The dream of returning home, of seeing their faces again, became a fragile lifeline against the despair. Imagine the sleepless nights spent staring at the stars, picturing the faces of your family, feeling a deep, physical pang of missing them, and the overwhelming wave of sadness that washed over you. Knowing they were thousands of miles and countless dangers away, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life where you never ventured beyond your backyard. Or perhaps just a very reliable medieval postal service with express delivery. The sheer separation from your former life was absolute. Not just physical distance, but a complete break from the routines, customs, and comforts that defined your existence. The smells. The foods, remember scarcity of food from Section 6. The sounds. The very light of the Holy Land were alien. This profound disconnect made returning home, if you were lucky enough to survive, incredibly difficult, often leaving you feeling like a stranger in your own land, a bit of a callback to psychological trauma in Section 9. This pervasive homesickness highlights the immense emotional cost of crusading, demonstrating that the pursuit of a spiritual goal demanded an agonizing sacrifice of personal connection and familiarity, leaving countless crusaders to suffer in profound isolation and loneliness, often with little hope of ever truly returning to the life they had left behind. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this emotional toll is the accounts in Crusader letters and chronicles, when they exist, that often include poignant expressions of longing for home, for family, and for the familiar landscapes of Europe, reflecting the deep emotional distress caused by their prolonged absence and the uncertainty of their return. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, particularly those from humble backgrounds, would reportedly carry small pouches of soil from their home villages or dried flowers from their family gardens as a tangible connection to the land and loved ones they had left behind. Periodically smelling or touching these mementos in moments of intense homesickness. Imagine cradling a handful of dirt from your backyard to feel closer to home. It certainly highlights their desperate need for connection. Historians still argue whether the widespread homesickness and loneliness among crusaders primarily contributed to high rates of desertion and a general decline in morale, making their armies less effective over long campaigns. Or if, for some, the shared suffering and longing for home actually fostered deeper bonds of camaraderie and mutual support among the surviving comrades. Did it break them or unite them regardless? Your life as a crusader was haunted by pervasive homesickness, suffering profound isolation, debilitating loneliness, and agonizing separation. So, your life as a crusader was haunted by pervasive homesickness, suffering profound isolation, debilitating loneliness, and agonizing separation. But for all the physical and psychological hardships, the very engine driving you forward, pushing you through every trial, was a double-edged sword: religious zealotry, fanaticism, intolerance, brutality. Forget nuanced faith and peaceful conversion in the crucible of the Crusades. Fervent belief often twisted into an inflexible dogma, fueling both incredible endurance and horrifying acts of aggression, making your piety a justification for unspeakable cruelty. Imagine the impassioned sermons igniting a furious resolve, the righteous conviction that your enemies were infidels deserving of no mercy, and the chilling willingness to commit atrocities in the name of God, all while believing you were earning divine favor. This was the omnipresent reality of religious zealotry. The Crusades were born from a powerful religious impulse, a desire to reclaim holy sites and seek spiritual salvation. But this fervent belief, untempered by charity or understanding, could quickly morph into something darker, transforming piety into a license for violence. You were not just a believer, You were an instrument of God's perceived will, convinced that every action, however horrific, was divinely sanctioned. It's like being a modern-day extreme ideologue, but your ideology is medieval theology, and your cause allows for mass murder. The intense devotion often manifested as sheer fanaticism. Crusaders believed they were literally fighting for God, their actions imbued with sacred purpose. This belief could grant incredible resilience in the face of suffering. Remember, hunger and disease from previous sections and an unwavering determination. But it also bred an uncritical acceptance of brutal acts, viewing any suffering inflicted upon the enemies of Christ as righteous and necessary. Imagine the unwavering gaze of a comrade rushing into overwhelming odds, convinced that death in battle would guarantee immediate entry to heaven, and the chilling fervor in their eyes as they prepared to slaughter, their faith making them utterly fearless and merciless. This fanaticism invariably led to rampant intolerance. Anyone who did not conform to the crusading ideal, Muslims, Jews, or even Eastern Christians, remember those cultural clashes from Section 7, could be viewed as an enemy, an infidel, or a heretic. Their lives, property, and beliefs were deemed worthless in comparison to the holy cause. This often resulted in horrific massacres and widespread destruction. Justified by religious doctrine, imagine encountering a community of people who simply practiced a different form of Christianity, only to see them treated with suspicion, their churches desecrated, and their property plundered. Simply because they weren't your kind of Christian, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life where religion was a private matter. Or perhaps just a very effective medieval interfaith dialogue committee. The ultimate and most terrifying consequence was overt brutality. Religious zealotry provided the moral framework for widespread atrocities. Massacres of entire populations in captured cities like Jerusalem in 1099, indiscriminate slaughter of non-combatants, and gratuitous acts of cruelty became chilling hallmarks of certain crusading campaigns. This wasn't just battlefield necessity, it was often driven by a chilling conviction that such acts were pleasing to God. Imagine witnessing the wholesale slaughter of men, women, and children after a city fell, their screams echoing in your ears, and the terrifying realization that your own comrades, ostensibly fighting for a holy cause, were capable of unimaginable savagery, fueled by their twisted faith. This pervasive religious zealotry highlights the complex and often horrifying intersection of faith and violence during the Crusades, demonstrating how a powerful spiritual motivation, when unchecked, could lead to extreme fanaticism, brutal intolerance, and widespread atrocities, leaving a profound and often dark legacy on both the perpetrators and the victims of holy war. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this brutal aspect is the documented massacres that occurred during the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 by the First Crusaders, wherein thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were indiscriminately slaughtered, acts vividly described by both Western and Arab chroniclers, showcasing the extreme brutality fueled by religious fervor. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some crusaders, in a highly literal interpretation of biblical passages about smiting enemies, would reportedly carve crude crosses into the bodies of fallen foes, or even brand symbols of the cross onto their own skin, believing these acts would somehow purify their violent deeds or mark them as true warriors of God. Imagine scarring your own flesh with a cross after killing someone. It certainly highlights the depths of their fanatical devotion. Historians still argue whether the intense religious zealotry of the Crusaders was the primary driving force behind their initial successes, granting them incredible resilience and courage, or if it ultimately undermined their long-term objectives by alienating potential allies, provoking fierce resistance, and leading to unsustainable acts of extreme violence. Did it empower them, or destroy them regardless? Your life as a crusader was defined by religious zealotry, leading to fervent fanaticism, chilling intolerance, and horrifying brutality. So, your life as a crusader was defined by religious zealotry, leading to fervent fanaticism, chilling intolerance, and horrifying brutality. But even beyond the open field battles and sudden ambushes, some of the most agonizing experiences of the Crusades unfolded in a slow, grinding torture siege warfare starvation, terror, slow death, forget quick, decisive victories. Sieges were drawn-out ordeals of immense suffering, making you a prisoner of hunger, fear, and the agonizing certainty that relief might never come. Imagine the endless days of gnawing hunger. Remember that scarcity of food from Section 6, the constant barrage of enemy projectiles, and the slow, insidious despair that settled in as hope dwindled with every passing week. This was the omnipresent reality of siege warfare, capturing fortified cities and castles. Essential objectives in the Holy Land often required prolonged sieges. These were not swift assaults, but agonizing tests of endurance for both besiegers and besieged. You were not just a soldier, you were a weary, starving pawn trapped in a grim game of attrition, where time was as deadly an enemy as any sword. It's like being trapped in a modern-day bunker for months. But the air smells like death, the water is tainted, and the only sound is giant rocks smashing into the walls. The most pervasive torment was relentless starvation. Both sides in a siege would eventually run out of food. For the besiegers, supply lines could be cut, or local resources plundered. Remember cultural clashes from Section 7 to the point of exhaustion? For the besieged, trapped inside walls, their fate was a race against their dwindling stores. Imagine the emaciated faces of your comrades, their hollow eyes fixed on the distant horizon, hoping for a relief force that might never arrive. As your own stomach roared in protest, making every moment an agony of deprivation. Disease, remember horrific sanitation from Section 2 would often accompany the hunger. Compounding the misery, alongside hunger came pervasive terror. The constant threat of attack was relentless. Defenders would face catapulted rocks and flaming projectiles smashing into their walls. Besiegers would face desperate sallies from the city, or sudden barrages of arrows and boiling oil from the ramparts. And both sides lived with the constant threat of mines collapsing beneath them, or tunnels being sprung. Imagine the deafening thwack of a trebuchet launching a massive stone, the terrifying whistle of an incoming arrow, and the desperate scramble for cover, knowing that at any moment, your makeshift shelter could collapse or your position could be overrun, leading to a brutal end. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a shepherd far from any walls, or perhaps just a very effective medieval anti-projectile shield. This combination of hunger and terror often led to a slow death. If the siege didn't end with a decisive battle, it ended with attrition. People would simply waste away from hunger, succumb to disease, or be picked off by enemy archers and siege engines. The dying was a drawn-out, public spectacle, designed to break the morale of the opposing side. Imagine watching your friends slowly weaken, their skin turning pale, their breath shallow, until they simply stopped moving, their bodies joining the pile of unburied dead. A constant reminder of your own grim prospects if the siege continued. This grueling siege warfare highlights the protracted and immensely cruel nature of medieval warfare, demonstrating that the struggle for fortified positions was a test of endurance and human suffering that often dwarfed the brief, dramatic moments of open combat, reducing all participants to a state of desperate survival against overwhelming odds and profound misery. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the descriptions of the Siege of Antioch during the First Crusade 1097-1098, which lasted for many months and saw both besiegers and besieged suffer immense casualties from starvation, disease, and the constant threat of assault. Becoming one of the most brutal and drawn-out episodes of the entire crusading era, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some besieged crusaders, in a grim attempt to conserve their dwindling food supplies, would reportedly catch and eat rats, mice, and even insects found within the city walls, transforming their diet into something truly horrific as desperation set in. and sometimes even using the bones of their dead as fuel for fires. Imagine meticulously preparing a roasted rat for dinner. It certainly highlights the depths of their depravity during desperate times. Historians still argue whether the extreme suffering endured during Crusader sieges primarily strengthened the resolve of the survivors, forging a hardened and deeply committed fighting force, or if it instead led to widespread demoralization, mass desertion, and a cynical disregard for human life that ultimately undermined their long-term effectiveness and moral standing. Did it make them tougher, or just more brutal regardless? Your life as a crusader was repeatedly defined by the agonizing reality of siege warfare, enduring relentless starvation, pervasive terror, and the specter of slow death. So, your life as a crusader was repeatedly defined by the agonizing reality of siege warfare, enduring relentless starvation, pervasive terror, and the specter of slow death. But even if you miraculously navigated every single horror of the crusade, the grueling marches, the rampant disease, the constant danger, the primitive medicine, the brutal weather, the gnawing hunger, the cultural clashes, the financial ruin, the psychological trauma, the failing equipment, the leadership squabbles, the crushing homesickness, the corrosive zealotry, and the grueling sieges, one final, devastating blow often awaited uncertain return death. Disability, disillusionment. Forget a hero's welcome and a comfortable retirement. For the vast majority, the journey home was as perilous as the outward bound, often ending in anonymity, suffering, or a bitter realization that your immense sacrifices had been for naught. Imagine the long, arduous journey back, constantly battling the same perils you faced on the way out, only to find a world that had moved on without you, or a body that was irrevocably broken. This was the omnipresent reality of your uncertain return. Very few crusaders, especially common soldiers, ever made it back to their homes. Those who did were often profoundly changed, physically and mentally, and often poorer than when they left. You were not just a survivor, you were a ghost in your old life. Struggling to find your place in a world that had forgotten your holy quest. It's like being a modern-day veteran returning from a forgotten war. But there are no benefits, no support, and everyone just thinks you're a weird old guy with a 1,000-yard stare. The most common outcome was, simply, death, whether from a lingering wound, a new disease contracted on the return journey, remember contagion from Section 13, a shipwreck, or an ambush by opportunistic bandits. The road home was littered with the bodies of those who had survived the Holy Land, only to perish on the way back. Imagine a shallow grave by the roadside, marked by nothing but a rough cross. Your final resting place thousands of miles from home. Your sacrifice unremembered by all but the dwindling few who mourned your absence. Your name might be added to a list in a distant parish, but your story ended quietly, abruptly, and without fanfare. For those who did survive, often disability was their constant companion. A missing limb from an old wound, remember primitive medicine from Section 4. A chronic cough from a bout of dysentery. Or debilitating aches from years of exposure and malnutrition, remember extreme weather and scarcity of food would make a normal working life impossible. You were no longer the able-bodied man who left. You were a burden, a cripple, dependent on charity or the kindness of dwindling family. Imagine struggling to lift a tool with a mangled hand, limping through fields that were once easy to traverse, and the quiet despair of being unable to provide for yourself or your family. Your body a living testament to the brutal cost of your crusade. And perhaps most soul-crushing was the pervasive disillusionment. The spiritual ideals that propelled you might have shattered against the brutal realities of the conflict, leaving you with a profound crisis of faith, a callback to psychological trauma and religious zealotry. The promise of heavenly reward might feel hollow after experiencing so much earthly hell. You might return to find your lands gone, remember financial ruin from Section 8. Your family scattered, and your former position in society lost. The glory you dreamed of was absent, replaced by a bitter emptiness. Imagine telling your tales of horror and heroism, only to be met with blank stares or polite indifference from those who had never left their comfortable homes, realizing that your epic struggle was meaningless to them, leaving you utterly alone in your memories. This profound, uncertain return highlights the final, often tragic, chapter in the Crusader's life, demonstrating that even survival was rarely a triumph, but often a continuation of suffering, ending in anonymity, physical brokenness, or a crushing disillusionment that underscored the immense and often unrewarded sacrifices made for the holy cause. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these challenges is the historically low survival rate for common crusaders, with estimates suggesting that only a small percentage of those who initially took the cross ever returned to their homes in Europe, with many dying on the journey, in battle, from disease, or lingering effects of their service. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some returning crusaders, particularly those with severe physical deformities or psychological scars, would reportedly avoid large towns or even their own villages, choosing instead to become hermits or beggars on remote roads, unable or unwilling to reintegrate into a society that no longer recognized them, effectively disappearing into medieval obscurity. Imagine choosing to live out your days alone in the wilderness rather than face your old life. It certainly highlights the profound alienation they experienced. Historians still argue whether the high rates of death, disability, and disillusionment among returning crusaders primarily contributed to a gradual decline in the popular appeal of subsequent crusades. As potential recruits saw the grim reality of the undertaking, or if the lingering narratives of heroic sacrifice, however rare, continue to inspire new generations. Despite the overwhelming evidence of personal tragedy, did the grim reality deter? Or did the myth persist? Now, let the dust settle on the long, hard road. The screams fade from your ears, and the gnawing hunger release its grip. You can let go of the relentless physical suffering, the constant threat of violence, and the profound mental anguish of being a medieval crusader. Their world, filled with a grim determination and unimaginable hardships, was a testament to human endurance. But their lives were undeniably brutal. That distant, unforgiving, and often tragically misguided ancient world belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.